The eviction notice was already printed when Caleb Brooks served his last plate of food. Outside, the winter wind clawed at the windows of his dying diner, while inside, creditors circled like wolves waiting for the kill. His neighbors had stopped calling him kind. They called him a fool, a bleeding heart too stupid to survive. Yet when the homeless man stumbled through the door that night, shivering and hollow-eyed, Caleb did the only thing he knew how to do. He gave him everything left in the kitchen, every last scrap, every remaining dollar of hope, knowing it would cost him everything by morning. If you want to see how far a single act of kindness can travel, stay with me until the end. And when you do, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story reaches. The fluorescent light above the grill had been flickering for 3 weeks. Caleb kept meaning to fix it, kept adding it to the list of things that needed attention, but the list had grown so long it had become meaningless, just like the stack of bills rubber-banded together in the drawer beneath the register, just like the promises he'd made to himself about turning things around. The diner sat on the corner of 5th and Morrison, wedged between a pawn shop that had gone out of business 2 years ago and a laundromat that stayed open 24 hours because its owner had nowhere else to go. Caleb understood that feeling. The building itself was narrow, almost painfully so, with a counter running along one side and 8 booths pressed against the opposite wall. The vinyl on the seats had cracked years ago, exposing yellow foam that Caleb had tried to cover with duct tape until he'd run out of both tape and dignity. It was 7:30 on a Thursday evening in February, and the dinner rush, if you could call 3 customers a rush, had come and gone. Old Mr. Patterson had ordered his usual coffee and toast, sitting in the corner booth for 2 hours while he worked a crossword puzzle with a pencil worn down to a nub. The Morrison twins, teenage girls who lived in the apartment building across the street, had split a plate of fries and giggled over their phones until their mother texted them to come home. And that was it. That was the sum total of Caleb's customer base on what should have been one of the busiest nights of the week. He stood behind the counter now, a dish rag in his hands, wiping down the same spot he'd wiped 10 minutes ago. The motion was automatic, mindless, something to do with his hands, while his thoughts spiraled in directions he didn't want them to go. The building's owner, Marcus Chen, had called that morning. The conversation had been brief and unpleasant. "Caleb, I need the rent." "I know. I'm working on it." "You said that last month and the month before." "Business has been slow. Business has been dead." Marcus's voice had carried the weariness of a man who'd had this conversation too many times. "I've got my own bills to pay, my own family to feed. I can't keep carrying you. Just give me 2 more weeks, please." The silence on the other end had stretched so long Caleb thought the call had dropped. Then, 1 week, 7 days. "If I don't have the full amount by next Thursday, I'm filing eviction papers. I'm sorry, Caleb, I really am. But I can't do this anymore." The call had ended there. Caleb had stood in the empty diner, phone still pressed to his ear, listening to dead air and feeling something inside him crack just a little bit more. That had been 12 hours ago. Since then, he'd served exactly 7 meals and made roughly $43. The rent was $2,800. The utilities were another $400. He owed his food supplier nearly $2,000, and they'd already stopped delivering. The eggs in the refrigerator were the last eggs. The bread on the shelf was the last bread. When they were gone, there would be nothing left to serve. Caleb folded the dish rag and set it on the counter. He was 34 years old, and he was failing. Not slowly, not gradually, but catastrophically. Completely. The kind of failure that people would remember, the kind they'd whisper about at church picnics and grocery store checkout lines. Remember Caleb Brooks? Tried to run that diner on 5th Street. Thought he could make it work through sheer goodwill. Poor bastard didn't last 2 years. He'd opened Brooks' Diner 18 months ago with everything he had. His savings, his mother's life insurance money, and a loan from a bank that had smelled desperation on him from the first handshake. The plan had been simple. Good food, fair prices, treat people with respect, build something that mattered. Create a place where the neighborhood could gather, where a working man could get a decent meal without emptying his wallet, where everyone was welcome. The problem was that good intentions didn't pay the rent. Kindness didn't keep the lights on. And in a neighborhood where 3 other diners had failed in the past 5 years, Caleb's determination to be different had only made him the fourth casualty. The door chimed. Caleb looked up, forcing his face into something resembling a smile. A woman in her 50s entered, shaking rain from her umbrella. Janet Holloway, one of his semi-regulars. She worked as a nursing assistant at the hospital downtown and stopped by once or twice a week for dinner on her way home. "Evening, Janet." "Hey, Caleb." She slid onto a stool at the counter, setting her purse down with a sigh that spoke of a long shift. "Just coffee tonight. I'm beat." "Coming right up?" He poured her a cup, his hands moving through the familiar ritual. Janet wrapped her fingers around the mug and took a long sip, her eyes closing briefly in appreciation. "You know," she said, setting the cup down, "I heard something today that upset me." Caleb's stomach tightened. "What's that?" "Couple of the girls at work were talking, saying you might be closing down soon." She looked at him directly, her gaze steady. "That true?" He considered lying, considered brushing it off with some vague reassurance, but Janet had always been straight with him, and she deserved the same in return. "Might be," he admitted. "Money's tight." "How tight?" 7 days until eviction, tight." Janet winced. "Jesus, Caleb." "Yeah." She took another sip of coffee, her expression thoughtful. What would it take to turn things around? A miracle, or about $10,000 and a complete reversal of fortune. "I could loan you something, not much, but..." "No." Caleb shook his head firmly. "No, Janet. I appreciate it, really, but I can't take money from you. You work too hard for what you've got." "So do you." "Not hard enough, apparently." She studied him for a long moment. "You're a good man, Caleb Brooks. Don't let this place convince you otherwise." The words hit harder than she probably intended. Caleb turned away, pretending to adjust something on the grill so she wouldn't see his face. "Thanks," he managed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Janet nursing her coffee while Caleb wiped down surfaces that were already clean. Outside, the rain had picked up, drumming against the windows with increasing intensity. The temperature was dropping too. By midnight, it would probably turn to sleet. The door chimed again. This time, Caleb didn't look up immediately. He was tired of forcing smiles, tired of pretending everything was fine, but when he finally raised his head, the words of greeting died in his throat. The man in the doorway was a wreck. 60, maybe older, with a gray beard matted with dirt and clothing that looked like it had been pulled from a dumpster. His coat was too thin for the weather, held together with safety pins where buttons had long since fallen off. His boots were split at the seams, and his hands, God, his hands were raw and red from the cold. He stood just inside the door, dripping rainwater onto the floor, looking around with the cautious uncertainty of someone who expected to be thrown out at any moment. Janet stiffened on her stool. Caleb felt her tension, saw the way her hand moved protectively closer to her purse. The homeless man's eyes found Caleb. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel sliding over metal. "I was wondering if you had any work. Washing dishes, taking out trash, anything. I can work for food." The smart thing, the business-savvy thing, would be to say no. To explain that the diner was barely surviving, that there was no money for additional help, that he could barely feed himself, let alone hire someone else. Caleb heard himself say, "When did you last eat?" The man blinked. "Yesterday, I think. Maybe the day before." "Sit down." "I can work." "Sit down," Caleb repeated, gentler this time. He gestured to the counter. "I'll make you something." The man hesitated, then moved slowly to a stool 3 down from Janet, as if trying to keep respectful distance. He lowered himself onto it carefully, like someone whose body had learned not to trust chairs. Caleb turned to the grill. There were 2 eggs left, some cheese that was still good, half a bell pepper, an onion, bread for toast. He could make an omelet, something with substance, something that would actually fill a man up. Behind him, he heard Janet shift on her stool. When he glanced over, she was watching the homeless man with an expression somewhere between suspicion and pity. "You want a refill?" Caleb asked her. "No." She stood, pulling a few dollars from her purse and setting them on the counter. "I should get home. Early shift tomorrow." Caleb nodded. They both knew she was leaving because of the new arrival, but neither of them said it out loud. When the door closed behind her, the diner fell silent except for the hiss of butter melting on the grill. Caleb cracked the eggs, whisked them in a bowl, added salt and pepper. The familiar motion steadied him, gave him something to focus on besides the calculator in his head, tallying up the cost of this meal against the bills he couldn't pay. "Name's Caleb," he said without turning around. "Thomas." The man's voice was quiet. "Thomas Reed? You from around here, Thomas?" "Used to be, long time ago." Caleb diced the pepper and onion, tossed them in with the eggs. The smell of cooking food filled the small space, warm and comforting. He added cheese, folded the omelet, let it set. Plated it with 2 slices of buttered toast and set it in front of Thomas along with a cup of coffee. Thomas stared at the plate like it was a mirage that might disappear if he looked away. "Go ahead," Caleb said. The man picked up the fork with shaking hands. He took a bite, and something in his face just crumpled. Not dramatically, not with tears or words, just a subtle collapse of whatever walls he'd built to keep going. He ate slowly, deliberately, making the food last as long as possible. Caleb turned away to give him privacy. He washed the pan, wiped down the grill, organized things that didn't need organizing. When he looked back, the plate was clean, and Thomas was staring at him with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "Thank you," Thomas said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. "You're welcome." "I meant what I said. About work. I can come back tomorrow, help however you need." Caleb almost laughed, almost explained that there might not be a tomorrow, that the diner was circling the drain, that charity was a luxury he couldn't afford. Instead, he said, "We'll see. For now, just focus on staying warm and dry." Thomas nodded slowly. He stood, pulling his inadequate coat tighter. "You're a good man." "Just a man," Caleb replied. Thomas left without another word. Through the window, Caleb watched him disappear into the rain-slicked darkness, becoming just another shadow in a city full of them. The next morning started the same way every morning started, with dread. Caleb woke in the apartment above the diner, a one-room space with a hot plate, a mattress on the floor, and a bathroom that smelled perpetually of mildew. He'd given up his real apartment 4 months ago, when he could no longer afford both rent and the diner. Moving into this space had been presented as temporary, a short-term sacrifice until things turned around. Things had not turned around. He made instant coffee with water heated in the microwave, stood at the window looking down at the street. Friday morning, gray and cold. 6 days until Marcus filed eviction papers. 6 days to find $2,800 plus utilities, plus everything else. 6 days to perform a miracle. The morning passed in its usual slow agony. A few customers trickled in, coffee and toast, nothing substantial. Caleb served them with automatic courtesy while his mind churned through impossible calculations. He could call his sister in Phoenix, ask for help, but she had 3 kids and a husband who'd been laid off. He could try another bank, but his credit was already destroyed. He could... The door chimed. Thomas Reed stood in the entrance, looking exactly as he had the night before, except somehow smaller in the daylight. His eyes found Caleb, and something passed between them. A question. An offer. A plea. "I know you said we'd see about work," Thomas began, "but I thought I'd come by anyway, in case you needed help." Caleb should have said no, should have explained reality. Instead, he heard himself say, "You know how to wash dishes?" Thomas's face transformed. "Yes, sir, I do." "Back room, sink's on the left. There's not much, but what's there needs doing." Thomas moved past the counter like he was afraid Caleb might change his mind. Within minutes, Caleb heard the sound of running water, the clink of dishes being washed. The old man worked steadily for 3 hours. When Caleb checked on him, every dish was clean, the counters were wiped down, and Thomas had even organized the dry goods in a way that made more sense than Caleb's haphazard system. "Thomas." The man looked up, alert. "You hungry? I can wait until... I'm asking if you're hungry." "Yes, sir." Caleb made 2 sandwiches with the last of the cold cuts. They ate together at the counter, not talking much, just 2 men sharing a meal in a dying diner on a Friday afternoon. When Thomas finished, he wiped his mouth carefully with a napkin. "I could come back tomorrow, help with the weekend rush." There was no weekend rush. There hadn't been a weekend rush in 6 months, but Caleb found himself nodding. "Sure, if you want." "I want." Thomas left, and Caleb stood alone in the empty diner, wondering what the hell he was doing. Feeding a homeless man when he could barely feed himself. offering work when there was no money to pay for it, building relationships when everything was about to collapse. But when Thomas showed up Saturday morning exactly on time, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Less alone. They fell into a rhythm. Thomas washed dishes, swept floors, took out trash. Caleb cooked what little food remained, served the handful of customers who wandered in. They didn't talk much, but there was comfort in the shared silence, in having another person present who expected nothing beyond the work itself. Sunday followed the same pattern, then Monday. On Tuesday, Caleb opened the cash register and counted out $47.63. That was it. That was everything. Rent was due in 4 days, and he had $47.63. He was making lunch for Thomas, soup from a can, crackers, the last apple, when someone knocked on the window. Caleb looked up to see Marcus Chen peering through the glass, gesturing for him to open the door. Marcus entered with the weariness of a man delivering bad news. He was in his 50s, stocky and gray-haired, wearing a jacket that had seen better days. He'd owned the building for 20 years, had seen businesses come and go, had probably learned not to get attached. Caleb? Marcus. I need to talk to you. Thomas, sensing the tension, quietly moved toward the back room. Marcus watched him go with curious eyes but didn't comment. I'm not here to make this harder than it needs to be, Marcus said. But I've got to know. Do you have the rent? Caleb could have lied, could have bought himself a few more days with false promises, but he was tired of lying, tired of pretending. No. Marcus's shoulders sagged. How much do you have? $47. Jesus, Caleb. I know. You're a good guy. I've always thought that, but good doesn't pay the bills. I know that too. Marcus pulled an envelope from his jacket. I brought the eviction notice. I'm supposed to give you 72 hours from the time I deliver this. So Thursday. Thursday. Marcus held out the envelope, and Caleb took it with numb fingers. I'm sorry, I really am. It's not your fault. Doesn't make it easier. Marcus moved toward the door, then paused. What'll you do? I don't know. You got family? Somewhere to go? I'll figure it out. Marcus nodded, knowing a dismissal when he heard one. The door closed behind him, and Caleb stood there holding the envelope, feeling the weight of official paper and legal language and the end of everything. Thomas emerged from the back room. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. The answer was written all over Caleb's face. I should probably go, Thomas said quietly. Why? Because you don't need one more mouth to feed. Caleb looked at him. This man who had nothing, who'd been sleeping God knows where, who'd probably spent the last decade being told he was worthless and useless and invisible. This man who still showed up every morning on time, who worked without complaint, who said thank you for every scrap of food like it was a feast. Actually, Caleb said, I think I need exactly that. Thomas's eyes widened slightly. I've got food for maybe 3 more days, Caleb continued. After that, I've got nothing. But until then, we might as well eat together. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. Something shifted in Thomas's expression. Not gratitude exactly. Something deeper. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of one struggling human by another. They ate lunch together in silence. The soup was mediocre. The crackers stale. The apple bruised. It was one of the best meals Caleb had eaten in months. That afternoon, word started to spread. Caleb didn't know how. Maybe Mr. Patterson had mentioned something at the senior center. Maybe the Morrison twins had posted something online. But people knew. They knew the diner was closing, knew Caleb was days away from eviction, knew this was the end. Some people expressed sympathy. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop came by to say how sorry she was, how much she'd miss having the diner in the neighborhood. A few others offered similar condolences. Their words kind but ultimately meaningless. But there were others. Others who saw Caleb's failure as confirmation of what they'd always suspected. The kindness was weakness. The generosity was stupidity. The trying to run a business based on anything other than ruthless profit was doomed from the start. He heard them talking outside the window. Didn't mean to eavesdrop, but sound carried on the cold air. I told you he wouldn't last. That was Donald Frazier, who owned the convenience store 2 blocks down. You can't give away food and expect to stay in business. Did you see that homeless guy he's got working in there? Someone Caleb didn't recognize. Probably stealing him blind. Brooks is too soft, too naive. This is what happens when you try to run a charity instead of a business. The words shouldn't have hurt. Caleb knew they were coming, had been bracing for them. But knowing and experiencing were different things. Each comment was a small cut, death by 1,000 casual cruelties. Thomas appeared at his shoulder, silent as always. He'd heard it too. Caleb could see it in the tight set of his jaw, the way his hands clenched briefly into fists before relaxing. "People talk," Thomas said finally. "Doesn't mean they know anything." "They're not wrong, though." "About what?" "I am too soft, too naive. I did give away too much." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and firm. "You gave food to hungry people, including me. That's not soft. That's not naive. That's human." Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to explain that humanity didn't pay the rent, didn't keep the lights on, didn't save failing businesses. But the words died in his throat because what would be the point? In 72 hours, none of it would matter anyway. Wednesday morning brought freezing rain, the kind that made the sidewalks treacherous and kept most people indoors. Caleb opened the diner anyway, more out of habit than hope. The lights flickered when he flipped the switch. The electric company had sent a final notice yesterday, but they held. Thomas arrived 10 minutes later, soaked through and shivering. Caleb handed him a towel without comment, started coffee, made toast with the last of the bread. They ate in silence, listening to freezing rain assault the windows. Outside, the city looked gray and hostile, like it was actively trying to drive them out. "This is it, isn't it?" Thomas said finally. "Last day. Tomorrow's the last day, technically. Then what?" "Then they change the locks. Then I figure out what comes next." Thomas wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "You ever regret it? Being kind when you couldn't afford to be?" Caleb considered the question. Thought about every free meal he'd given, every bill he'd let slide when someone was struggling, every time he'd chosen compassion over profit. Thought about the $47 in the register and the eviction notice in his pocket. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret it. Even now? Even when it cost you everything? Even now?" Thomas studied him with those intense eyes. "You mean that?" "I do." "Why?" It was a fair question. Caleb tried to put it into words, that this thing he'd felt but never quite articulated. Because the alternative is worse. Because becoming hard and calculating and mean just to survive feels like dying in a different way. Because, he paused, searching. Because I'd rather fail trying to be decent than succeed at being something I hate. Thomas didn't respond. He just nodded once, slowly, like Caleb had confirmed something he'd suspected all along. The day crawled past, no customers came, the weather was too miserable, the rumors too discouraging. Caleb and Thomas sat in the empty diner like the last two passengers on a sinking ship, waiting for the inevitable. Around 2 o'clock, Thomas stood abruptly. "I need to go out for a bit." "In this weather?" "Won't be long." Before Caleb could argue, Thomas was gone, disappearing into the freezing rain without explanation. Caleb watched him go, feeling uneasy for reasons he couldn't name. Thomas was gone for 3 hours. When he returned, he was even more soaked than before, his hands shaking from cold. He wouldn't explain where he'd been, just muttered something about taking care of business and disappeared into the back room to dry off. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He lay on his mattress in the dark apartment, listening to ice tick against the window, thinking about tomorrow, about packing up what little he owned, about calling his sister, admitting defeat, asking for help he couldn't repay, about starting over at 34 with nothing to show for the past 18 months except debt and failure, about Thomas Reed, who'd appeared out of nowhere and asked for nothing except the chance to work for food, who showed up every day, who listened more than he spoke, who looked at Caleb sometimes with an expression that seemed to see right through to the core of things. Somewhere around 3 a.m., Caleb finally drifted off, his dreams full of locked doors and empty pockets and voices whispering that they'd told him so. Thursday morning arrived with cruel sunshine. The freezing rain had stopped, leaving everything coated in ice that glittered like broken glass. Caleb woke early, dressed in clothes that were clean but worn, went downstairs to open the diner one last time. Thomas was already there, standing outside the locked door, waiting. Of course he was. They prepared for a day that wouldn't really happen, made coffee that probably wouldn't be drunk, straightened chairs that probably wouldn't be sat in, wiped down counters that in a few hours would belong to someone else. At 9 o'clock, a black SUV pulled up outside. Caleb's stomach dropped. Marcus must have sent someone official, maybe a sheriff's deputy or a legal representative, someone to make sure the eviction proceeded smoothly, to ensure Caleb didn't try to squat or make trouble. But when the passenger door opened, the man who stepped out wasn't wearing a uniform. He was wearing a suit. Expensive, tailored, the kind of suit that cost more than Caleb made in 6 months. He was followed by 2 others, also in suits, all of them moving with the casual confidence of people who knew they belonged wherever they decided to stand. Behind them, 2 more SUVs pulled up. More suits emerged. They weren't police or deputies or lawyers. They were something else entirely, something that made the hair on the back of Caleb's neck stand up. The first man, tall, silver-haired, maybe 60, approached the diner's entrance. He paused there, his hand on the door, and looked directly through the window. His eyes found Caleb's. Then they found Thomas. And Thomas looked back without surprise. The man opened the door and stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of expensive cologne and winter air. The others followed, fanning out in a way that was practiced, professional, almost military. Caleb's heart was hammering. "Can I help you?" The silver-haired man smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, but it wasn't threatening either. It was the smile of someone who knew something you didn't and was about to enjoy revealing it. "Actually," he said, "we're here to help you." Then he looked at Thomas again, and Thomas stood up from where he'd been sitting at the counter. Stood up and moved toward the man with a familiarity that made Caleb's world tilt sideways. "Hello, David," Thomas said. His voice was different now, steadier, stronger. The gravel was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something that sounded like authority. The man, David, inclined his head respectfully. "Mr. Reed." Mr. Reed. Caleb's mind was spinning. What? Thomas turned to him, and in that moment Caleb saw it. Saw past the matted beard and worn clothing and raw hands. Saw something in the eyes that he should have noticed before, should have recognized. Intelligence, calculation, purpose. "Caleb," Thomas said gently, "I think we need to talk." The world stopped making sense. Caleb stood frozen behind his counter, the counter he'd wiped down 1,000 times, the counter where he'd served coffee to struggling neighbors and counted out his last $47, and watched as everything he thought he understood began to unravel. Thomas Reed, the homeless man who'd stumbled through his door 5 days ago, shivering and desperate, was standing straighter now. The hunch in his shoulders had disappeared. The uncertain shuffle in his step was gone. He looked at the man called David with a familiarity that spoke of history, of relationship, of something that had nothing to do with sleeping on streets and begging for work. "I don't understand," Caleb said. His voice sounded distant to his own ears, like it was coming from underwater. Thomas, if that was even his real name, turned back to him. The beard was still matted, the clothes still worn, but something fundamental had shifted. "I know you don't, and I'm sorry for the deception, but I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say." One of the suited men stepped forward, pulling a leather folder from his briefcase. David, the silver-haired man who'd entered first, gestured for him to wait. "Let's sit down," David said. "This conversation deserves that much respect." Respect. The word felt absurd given the circumstances. Caleb looked around his dying diner, at the cracked vinyl booths and flickering lights, at the eviction notice still sitting on the counter where he'd left it yesterday. Respect seemed like the wrong word for whatever this was. But he nodded anyway, because what else was there to do? The men in suits took positions throughout the diner, not threatening, but present, like Secret Service protecting a dignitary. David and Thomas moved to the largest booth, and after a moment's hesitation, Caleb followed. They sat, the 3 of them, with the winter sunlight streaming through dirty windows and ice melting in the gutters outside. Caleb's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the table to steady them. My real name is Thomas Reed, the homeless man began. That part was true. But I'm not what you thought I was. Or rather, I am, but I'm also something else. You're not homeless, Caleb said flatly. No, I'm not. You lied to me. I misrepresented myself, yes, but I never lied about why I was here. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes intense. I was testing you, Caleb. Testing your character, your integrity, your capacity for compassion when it cost you something real. The words hit like a physical blow. Testing me. I own Reed Capital Investments, Thomas continued. We're a private equity firm with portfolios in 23 countries. We manage approximately $47 billion in assets. And part of my job, the part I take most seriously, is identifying people worth investing in, not just businesses, people. Caleb's mind couldn't process the numbers. 47 billion. It was so far beyond his reality that it might as well have been monopoly money. You're telling me you're a billionaire. Several times over, yes. And you came to my diner dressed like a homeless person to… what? To see if I'd be nice to you? David spoke up, his voice measured and calm. Mr. Brooks, Thomas doesn't do this often. Maybe once or twice a year if he finds someone who catches his attention. He goes into the world stripped of everything that identifies him, his wealth, his power, his connections. He becomes invisible, and then he watches how people treat invisible people. Why? The question came out sharper than Caleb intended. Thomas's expression softened. Because character is what you do when you think nobody important is watching. Because it's easy to treat powerful people well. There's incentive, there's potential benefit. But how you treat someone who can offer you nothing in return, someone society has deemed worthless, that tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. Caleb thought back over the past 5 days. Every meal he'd served Thomas, every conversation they'd shared, every moment had been observed, cataloged, measured against some standard Caleb hadn't known existed. You watched me fail, he said quietly. You watched me go bankrupt feeding people, including you. You watched me lose everything. I watched you choose dignity over profit, Thomas corrected. I watched you treat a stranger with respect when you could barely afford to feed yourself. I watched you offer work to someone the world had written off. I watched you defend that choice to your neighbors even when they called you a fool. I am a fool. Look where it got me. It got you here, to this moment, to this conversation. Thomas gestured to David, who opened the leather folder. We've spent the past 3 days conducting due diligence on you and your situation. Financial records, credit history, interviews with neighbors and suppliers, and anyone who's interacted with your business. We know everything, Caleb, the good and the bad. Caleb's stomach churned. That's invasive as hell. It is, Thomas agreed without apology, but necessary. Because what I'm about to offer you requires absolute certainty on my part that you're who I think you are. David slid several documents across the table. Caleb looked down at them without comprehension. Numbers, legal language, official seals. The first document, David explained, is a payment in full of all outstanding debts related to this property. Rent, utilities, supplier invoices, everything. As of 10 minutes ago, you owe nothing to anyone. Caleb's vision blurred. He blinked hard, trying to focus on the words in front of him. You can't… The second document is a check for $50,000, deposited into an account we've established in your name. Immediate access, no strings attached. That's for restocking, repairs, upgrades, and operating capital to get you through the next 6 months. This isn't real, Caleb's voice cracked. This can't be real. The third document, David continued, ignoring his protest, is a contract. If you choose to sign it, Reed Capital Investments becomes a silent partner in Brooks Diner. We provide additional capital for expansion, business development expertise, marketing support. You retain full operational control and 70% ownership. We take 30% and a seat on an advisory board that will meet quarterly. Caleb looked up at Thomas. Why? Why would you do this? Because I've spent 40 years building wealth, Thomas said. And I've learned that money compounds, but character doesn't. You either have it or you don't. You can't fake it, can't buy it, can't manufacture it under pressure. And you, Caleb Brooks, have it in abundance. I'm failing. I was 3 hours away from being evicted. You were failing at capitalism, Thomas corrected, but you were succeeding at humanity, and in my experience, the second is far rarer and far more valuable than the first. The diner door opened. Caleb looked up to see Marcus Chen standing in the doorway, his expression confused and wary. He took in the scene, the suits, the documents, the tense energy in the air, and stopped short. Caleb? What's going on? Before Caleb could answer, David stood and approached Marcus with the smooth confidence of someone used to controlling rooms. Mr. Chen? David Park, Chief Legal Counsel for Reed Capital Investments. I believe we spoke on the phone earlier. Marcus's confusion deepened. Yeah, about the building lease, but I don't... He stopped, his eyes going to the papers on the table. What is this? Your tenant's rent is paid in full for the next 12 months, David said, along with a signing bonus for agreeing to a 5-year lease renewal with terms favorable to both parties. The contracts were emailed to you 20 minutes ago. I trust you've had a chance to review them? Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolled through emails with shaking hands. Caleb watched his face cycle through disbelief, shock, and finally something like awe. You're serious? All of this is serious? Completely serious, Marcus looked at Caleb. Did you know about this? I found out about 3 minutes before you walked in. Jesus Christ. Marcus sat down heavily in the nearest booth, still staring at his phone. Jesus Christ. Thomas remained focused on Caleb. I know this is a lot to process. I know it seems impossible. But I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't charity. This is investment. I don't give money away because people are nice. I invest in people who have the character to build something meaningful when given the resources to do so. You don't know me, Caleb protested. 5 days. You watched me for 5 days. That's not enough to sit... I've been watching you for 6 weeks. The words landed like a bomb. What? Thomas's expression remained steady. I first heard about you from Janet Holloway. She's my niece's best friend, works at the hospital downtown. She mentioned this diner owner who kept giving away food he couldn't afford to give away, who treated everyone with respect regardless of whether they could pay. She thought it was foolish but admirable. I thought it was worth investigating. Caleb's mind reeled. Janet. He'd served her coffee 3 times a week for months, never knowing she was connected to anything beyond her nursing shifts and tired smiles. I sent people here, Thomas continued. Different people on different days. They posed as customers, as delivery drivers, as city inspectors. They all reported the same thing. You were consistent, unfailingly kind even when you were stressed. Fair even when it cost you. You treated the Morrison twins with the same respect you gave Mr. Patterson. You let Mrs. Chen slide on her bill when her husband was in the hospital. You gave a free meal to every person who asked, even when your supplies were running out. You had people spying on me. I had people verifying what Janet said was true. And it was. Every single time. Thomas paused. The homeless approach was the final test, the most extreme scenario. If you'd turned me away, if you'd treated me with suspicion or contempt, or even just indifference, I would have walked away. No judgment, no harm done. You would never have known I was anything other than what I appeared to be. But I didn't turn you away. No, you didn't. You fed me with food you couldn't spare. You offered me work you couldn't pay for. You defended me to your neighbors even when they called you stupid for it. You chose compassion over self-preservation, over and over again, even as your world collapsed around you. Caleb's throat was tight. I didn't do it for this. I didn't do it to impress anyone. I know. That's exactly why it matters. Across the diner, Marcus was still staring at his phone, occasionally muttering phrases like 12 months and signing bonus under his breath. David had moved to the window, speaking quietly into his cell phone while keeping one eye on the room. Caleb looked down at the documents again. The check alone would change everything, would let him restock properly, fix the wiring, replace the equipment that had been failing for months, would give him breathing room to actually run the diner instead of just watching it die by inches. But the contract, the partnership, that was something else entirely. That was tying himself to people he didn't know, to a world he didn't understand. That was accepting help so vast it felt like surrender. "I need to think about this," he said finally. "Of course." Thomas nodded. "Take the time you need. Though I should mention, the debt payment has already been processed. That's not contingent on your decision about the partnership. Your rent is paid. Your suppliers are paid. That's done regardless of what you choose next." "Why? If I don't sign the contract, you've just given me $50,000 for nothing." "Not nothing. For being who you are. The partnership is a separate question. Whether you want to build something bigger, something that could serve more people, create more jobs, make a real difference in this neighborhood. But the debt relief is simply because you deserve a chance to catch your breath without the weight of immediate financial ruin crushing you." David returned from the window. "The wire transfer is confirmed. All creditors have been notified. Legally and financially, Mr. Brooks, you're free and clear as of this moment." Free and clear. The words didn't make sense. Caleb had been drowning for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe. Marcus stood up slowly, moving to the booth where they sat. He looked at Caleb with something like wonder. "You did it," he said. "I don't know how, but you actually did it." "I didn't do anything," Caleb replied. I tried not to be an asshole." "In this world?" Marcus shook his head. "That's everything." The door opened again. This time it was Janet Holloway, stopping by for her usual coffee before her afternoon shift. She took 2 steps inside before registering the scene, the suits, the tension, Marcus sitting in the booth, looking shell-shocked. "Oh," she said. "Am I interrupting something?" Thomas smiled at her. "Not at all. Come in, Janet. You should be here for this." She approached cautiously, her eyes moving from face to face. "Uncle Thomas? What are you doing here?" "Uncle Thomas?" Caleb repeated. Janet's face went pale. "Oh, God. Oh, no, you didn't." "I did." She turned to Caleb, her expression stricken. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know he was actually going to. I just mentioned you in conversation. I didn't think he'd actually show up and test me," Caleb finished. "Yeah, I'm getting that part. I should have warned you. Should have told you my uncle is completely insane and does things like this." "I prefer thorough," Thomas said mildly. Janet sat down next to Caleb, her hands twisting together. "Are you okay? Did he spring some weird offer on you? Because you absolutely don't have to accept anything. I know how he operates, and sometimes the strings attached to his generosity are—" "There are no strings," Thomas interrupted. "Caleb's debts are paid regardless of his decision about the partnership. He owes me nothing." She looked at him skeptically. "You paid off his debts? Just like that?" "Just like that." "Why?" "Because your instinct was correct. He's worth investing in." Janet turned back to Caleb. "Is this true? He actually paid everything?" Caleb nodded, still not quite believing it himself. "Holy shit," she breathed. "Holy shit, Caleb." Then she did something unexpected. She reached over and hugged him, hard, like she was trying to anchor him to reality through physical force alone. "You deserve this. You deserve every bit of this." Caleb's eyes burned. He blinked hard against the sudden threat of tears. When Janet pulled back, she was smiling. "So what happens now?" That was the question, wasn't it? What happened now? An hour ago, Caleb had been planning where to pack his belongings, who to call for help, how to rebuild from absolute zero. Now he had money in the bank, debts paid, and a partnership offer that could transform everything. "I don't know," he admitted. David checked his watch. "We should let you process this. Take whatever time you need to review the partnership contract. Talk to a lawyer if you'd like. We can recommend several independent attorneys who could advise you. There's no pressure, no timeline. Though," Thomas added, standing from the booth, "I would like to make one request." "What's that?" "Keep doing what you've been doing. Keep treating people well. Keep feeding anyone who's hungry. Keep being the kind of person who chooses compassion even when it's inconvenient." He paused. "The world has enough successful bastards. It needs more successful good people." The men in suits began filing out, moving with the same practiced efficiency they'd shown arriving. David handed Caleb a business card, heavy stock, embossed lettering, a phone number and email address. Anything you need, he said. Questions, concerns, whatever. Call any time. Thomas was the last to leave. He paused at the door, looking back at the diner with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. Satisfaction, maybe. Or hope. For what it's worth, Thomas said, these past 5 days reminded me why I do this work. Why I keep looking for people like you. Because you restored a little of my faith in humanity, Caleb Brooks. And that's worth more than any return on investment. Then he was gone, disappearing into one of the black SUVs that pulled away smoothly from the curb. The diner fell silent. Caleb, Janet, and Marcus sat in the sudden stillness, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Did that actually just happen? Marcus said finally. I think so, Caleb replied. Your homeless guy was a billionaire. Apparently. And he paid all your debts and offered you a partnership because you were nice to him. That's the general idea, yeah. Marcus started laughing, not hysterically, but with genuine amusement. This is the most insane thing I've ever witnessed, and I've owned buildings in this neighborhood for 20 years. Janet was reading through the contract that David had left behind, her expression growing more amazed with each page. Caleb, do you understand what this means? The expansion capital alone is enough to open 3 more locations. And the business development support, they're offering access to supply chains that would cut your food costs by 40%. This is incredible. It's overwhelming, Caleb corrected. That too. He stood up, needing to move, needing to do something with the energy coursing through his body. The diner looked the same as it had an hour ago, same cracked vinyl, same flickering lights, same worn counters. But everything was different. The weight that had been crushing him for months was gone, just gone, lifted like it had never existed. I need some air, he said. Outside, the ice was melting in the afternoon sun, turning the sidewalks into rivers of slush. Caleb stood on the corner of 5th and Morrison, watching the city move around him, cars passing, people walking, life continuing as it always had. They had no idea what had just happened in the diner behind him, no idea that someone's entire world had shifted in the space of a conversation. He thought about Thomas Reed, both versions of him. The homeless man who'd shuffled through the door asking for work, the billionaire who'd sat across from him in a $2,000 suit explaining about character and investment and faith in humanity. Were they the same person? Could they be? But then Caleb thought about himself. Who was he? The failure who'd been hours from eviction? The diner owner who'd fed people he couldn't afford to feed? The businessman being offered a partnership with a multi-billion-dollar firm? Maybe people weren't just one thing. Maybe they were all of their choices, all at once, contradictions, and all. Janet joined him on the sidewalk, her coat pulled tight against the cold. You okay? I don't know what I am. That's fair. She was quiet for a moment. I really am sorry about not warning you, about my uncle being completely crazy. Is he? Crazy? She considered the question. In some ways, yes. He's unconventional, that's for sure. Tests people in ways that would make normal billionaires uncomfortable. But he's also one of the most genuine people I know. When he says there are no strings, he means it. When he invests in someone, he's all in. How long has he been doing this? The homeless disguise thing? As long as I've known him. Maybe 15, 20 years? He didn't start out wealthy. That's part of it. His family was homeless for a while when he was a kid. He lived in shelters, slept in cars. He knows what it's like to be invisible, to have people look right through you like you don't exist. That explained something in Thomas's eyes. That understanding when Caleb had fed him, like he'd been remembering his own hunger. What happened to him? How did he end up where he is now? Someone helped him, Janet said simply. A teacher, I think, saw potential in this scruffy homeless kid and fought to get him into a better school, mentored him through college, believed in him when nobody else did. Thomas has spent his adult life trying to pay that forward, looking for people who have the character to be worth believing in. And he thinks I'm one of them. Apparently. Caleb watched a bus rumble past, belching exhaust. What if I'm not? What if I take his money and fail anyway? Then you fail. But you'll fail having tried, having given it your all. That's not the same as failing because you gave up or because you compromised who you are. Janet bumped his shoulder gently. My uncle doesn't invest in guaranteed success. He invests in people who are trying to do something meaningful. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't, but he says the trying matters most. They stood together in the cold, watching the city, while inside the diner Marcus was probably still sitting in shocked silence, staring at his phone. "I should go in," Caleb said finally. "Start figuring out what comes next." "You going to sign the partnership contract?" "I don't know yet. Need to read it more carefully. Maybe talk to that lawyer David mentioned." "Smart." Janet checked her watch. "I need to get to work." "But Caleb, I'm proud of you. I know that probably sounds condescending coming from me, but I mean it. You stayed who you were even when it cost you everything. That takes guts." She left, and Caleb returned to the diner alone. Marcus had finally emerged from his shock and was standing behind the counter, pouring himself coffee like he owned the place, which, Caleb supposed, he technically did. Or at least he owned the building that housed it. "You want some?" Marcus asked, holding up the pot. "Yeah, thanks." They drank coffee in comfortable silence. After a while, Marcus said, "You know what the craziest part is?" "What's that?" "People have been calling you a fool for months, saying you were too soft, too generous, too naive to survive. And they were right about the survival part. You weren't going to make it, but they were wrong about it being a weakness." He gestured to the documents still lying on the table. "Turns out being decent was the smartest business decision you ever made." "I didn't do it as a business decision." "I know, that's what makes it even better." Marcus set down his cup. "I've been a landlord for a long time, seen a lot of businesses come and go. Most of them fail because the owners were chasing profit and forgot about people. You did the opposite, chased people and forgot about profit, and somehow that's the thing that saved you." Caleb picked up the partnership contract, the pages heavy in his hands. The legal language was dense, but the basic structure was clear. Reed Capital would provide funding, expertise, and connections. Caleb would maintain control of the day-to-day operations and the diner's core mission. Profits would be split 70-30. An advisory board would meet quarterly to review progress and make strategic decisions. It was more than fair. It was generous to the point of seeming impossible. "You think I should sign it?" he asked Marcus. "I think you should do whatever feels right to you. But if you're asking my opinion, yeah, sign it. Take the help. Build something bigger. Give yourself the chance to succeed at both things, being profitable and being good." The afternoon faded into evening. A few customers trickled in, word having somehow spread that the diner wasn't closing after all. Mr. Patterson arrived for his usual coffee and toast, settling into his corner booth with his crossword puzzle. The Morrison twins came by, their eyes wide with curiosity about the black SUVs they'd seen earlier. Caleb served them all, moving through the familiar routines, but everything felt different now. Lighter, like the possibility of hope had returned to a place that had forgotten what it felt like. Around 8 o'clock, the door opened one more time. Caleb looked up, half expecting Thomas to have returned for some final test or revelation, but it was just a middle-aged woman he'd never seen before, bundled in a coat too thin for the weather, her eyes tired and uncertain. "Are you still open?" she asked hesitantly. "Yeah," Caleb said. "Come in. What can I get you?" She sat at the counter, her hands shaking slightly as she looked at the menu. "Just coffee, I think. I don't have much money." Something in Caleb's chest loosened. This was what it was about. Not the partnership contract or the paid debts or the promise of expansion. This moment, right here. This woman who needed coffee and kindness and a warm place to sit. "Coffee's on the house," he said. "And I've got some soup left if you're hungry. No charge." Her eyes filled with tears. "Really?" "Really." He served her coffee and soup, watched her wrap her hands around the warm bowl like it was precious. In that moment, Caleb understood something crucial. The money Thomas Reed had given him wasn't an ending. It wasn't even really about the diner. It was about making it possible for this to continue, for hungry people to be fed, for kindness to survive in a world that didn't always value it. That night, after closing, Caleb sat alone in the diner with the partnership contract spread before him. He read through every clause, every condition, every contingency. He made notes in the margins. He thought about what it would mean to say yes, to tie his future to people and systems he still didn't fully understand. But he also thought about Thomas Reed sitting where that woman had sat tonight, eating food Caleb had given him, watching and measuring and ultimately deciding that compassion was worth investing in. He thought about Janet's words, that trying mattered most, that failure while being true to yourself was different from success while compromising who you were. He thought about the weight that had been lifted from him today, and how it felt to breathe without that crushing pressure of imminent disaster. And he thought about tomorrow, and the next day, and all the days after that. All the people who might walk through that door hungry or desperate or just needing to be treated like they mattered. Around midnight, Caleb picked up a pen. His hand was steady as he signed his name at the bottom of the contract, agreeing to partner with Reed Capital Investments, committing to build something bigger than his small diner had ever been. He didn't know if it would work, didn't know if he was making the right choice. But he knew this. He was choosing to try, choosing to believe that maybe, just maybe, being decent really could be enough. In the morning, he'd call David Park and make it official. But for now, Caleb sat in his quiet diner, surrounded by cracked vinyl and flickering lights that would soon be fixed, and let himself feel something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. The signed contract sat on Caleb's counter like a loaded gun for exactly 3 hours before Donald Fraser walked past the window, stopped, backed up, and pressed his face against the glass. His expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something uglier as he spotted Caleb inside, still open, still serving the handful of early morning customers who'd shown up expecting business as usual. Caleb watched Donald's face contort through the window, watched him pull out his phone and make a call while staring directly at the diner. Within 20 minutes, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Not a mob, exactly, but enough people to make it clear that word was spreading faster than Caleb had anticipated. He'd called David Park at 7 that morning, scanned and emailed the signed contract, and received a confirmation within minutes that the partnership was official. David had promised that a team would arrive by Monday to begin the consultation process, assessing the current operation, identifying improvement opportunities, developing a strategic plan for expansion. That gave Caleb 3 days to run the diner as he always had, to ease into whatever came next. Apparently the neighborhood had other plans. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop was the first to actually enter, her expression caught between concern and accusation. "Caleb, what's going on? Donald says you made some kind of deal with rich people, says you're selling out." "I'm not selling out," Caleb replied, pouring her coffee without being asked. "I accepted a partnership that'll help me keep the diner running." "What kind of partnership?" Before he could answer, Donald himself pushed through the door, followed by 3 others Caleb recognized from the neighborhood. Donald owned the convenience store 2 blocks down, the one with security cameras on every corner and signs warning shoplifters about prosecution. He'd never actually eaten at Brooks' Diner, had made it clear from the beginning that he thought Caleb's approach to business was naive at best, suicidal at worst. "Well, well," Donald said, his voice dripping with false congeniality. "Look who's still here. Thought you were being evicted yesterday." "Plans changed," Caleb said evenly. "I'll say they did. Heard you had some fancy people in here, black SUVs, guys in suits." Donald leaned against the counter like he owned it. "Want to tell us what that was about?" "Not particularly." "Come on, Caleb. Neighborhood deserves to know if something's happening on their streets. If some corporation's moving in, taking over." "Nobody's taking over," Caleb interrupted. "I got some help with my debts, that's all." "That's all?" Donald laughed, but there was no humor in it. Marcus Chen just deposited a check big enough to pay for a new roof on his building. Janet Holloway's been telling people her uncle is some kind of billionaire who thinks you're special, and you're standing there saying, "That's all?" Mrs. Chen looked at Caleb with new eyes. "Is that true? About Janet's uncle?" Caleb set down the coffee pot carefully. He'd known this conversation was coming, had spent half the night trying to figure out how to handle it. The truth was complicated and would sound impossible, but lying felt worse. "Thomas Reed came to my diner last week looking like he was homeless," Caleb said. "I fed him, gave him work, treated him like a human being. Turns out he's wealthy and was testing to see how I'd respond. He liked what he saw and offered to help." The silence that followed was thick with judgment. "So you got charity," Donald said finally. "Rich man's pet project." "It's not charity. It's investment," Reed Capital is partnering with me to expand the diner, make it sustainable. Reed Capital? One of the other men spoke up. Gary something owned a pawn shop down the street. That's a real company? Very real, Caleb confirmed. And they're investing in this place? Gary looked around the diner with obvious skepticism, taking in the cracked vinyl and worn counters. Why? Because I was kind when it cost me everything, Caleb thought. Because I chose compassion over survival, because apparently that matters to some people. But he said, because they see potential. Donald snorted. Potential, right. What they see is an opportunity to buy into this neighborhood cheap, gentrify everything, drive up prices until people like us can't afford to live here anymore. That's not what this is, Caleb protested. That's exactly what this is. You think those billionaires care about you? About this neighborhood? They're using you, Caleb. Using your nice guy image to get their foot in the door. And you're too naive to see it. Mrs. Chen was nodding slowly, her earlier concern hardening into suspicion. Donald might be right. I've seen it happen in other neighborhoods. Rich investors come in, promise to help local businesses, then suddenly rents triple, and everyone who's lived here for decades gets pushed out. It's not like that, Caleb insisted, but even as he said it, doubt crept in. Was it like that? How well did he really know Thomas Reed? 5 days of observation and 1 conversation. That was it. That was the foundation he'd built his trust on. The door opened again. This time it was the Morrison twins, followed by their mother, Angela Morrison. She was in her 40s, worked 2 jobs to keep her family afloat, and had been one of Caleb's most loyal customers back when he could afford to occasionally let her tab slide. Is it true? Angela asked, her voice tight. About the partnership? Yes, Caleb said. And they paid all your debts? Yes. She walked up to the counter, her daughters hanging back by the door. How much money are we talking about, Caleb? I don't think that's... How much? He hesitated, then said, enough to clear everything and provide operating capital for 6 months, plus expansion funding if I choose to use it. Angela's expression crumpled. So just like that, you're fine. You're saved, while the rest of us are still struggling to make rent, to keep food on the table, to survive in a neighborhood that keeps getting more expensive. The accusation in her voice stung worse than anything Donald had said. Angela, this isn't about what? Isn't about the fact that you get rescued by a billionaire while my kids share a bedroom and I'm working 60 hours a week just to break even? Isn't about how some people get miracle endings while the rest of us just get to keep drowning? I didn't ask for this, Caleb said quietly. No, you just got lucky. Got noticed by the right person who decided you were worth saving. Her voice cracked. What about the rest of us, Caleb? What about the people who are just as kind, just as decent, who don't happen to catch a billionaire's attention? The question hung in the air like smoke. Caleb had no answer for it, no way to reconcile the arbitrary nature of what had happened to him with the continued struggles of everyone around him. I'm sorry, he said finally. I know it's not fair. No, Angela agreed. It's not. She turned to leave, her daughters following, and the diner felt colder for their absence. The others began filing out too, Donald throwing one last disgusted look over his shoulder. Enjoy your partnership, Brooks. Hope it's worth selling your soul for. When the door closed behind them, Mrs. Chen remained. She looked at Caleb with something that might have been pity. They're scared, she said. Scared of change. Scared of being left behind. You can't really blame them. I'm not trying to hurt anyone, Caleb said. I know, but good intentions don't mean much when people are worried about their survival. She sipped her coffee, her expression thoughtful. Be careful, Caleb. This partnership might save your diner, but it might cost you your neighbors. She left money on the counter, exact change, nothing more, and walked out. Through the window, Caleb watched her stop to talk with Donald and the others, their heads bent together in conversation that clearly wasn't favorable to him. The morning rush, such as it was, brought more of the same. People who'd heard rumors, people who wanted details, people who felt betrayed that Caleb had been saved while they continued to struggle. Mr. Patterson was one of the few who seemed genuinely happy for him, clapping him on the shoulder and saying, "Good for you, son. About time something went right." But even Mr. Patterson's support felt fragile, conditional, like it might evaporate the moment the diner changed in ways he didn't like. By noon, Caleb was exhausted from defending himself, from trying to explain what he barely understood himself. He'd just finished serving a sullen couple who'd ordered silently and eaten without meeting his eyes when his phone rang. David Park. "Caleb, we have a situation," David said without preamble. Caleb's stomach dropped. "What kind of situation?" "There's a reporter asking questions, local news. Someone tipped them off about the partnership, and now they want to do a story. Billionaire saves struggling diner angle." "No, absolutely not." "I agree, which is why I'm calling." Thomas doesn't want the publicity either. It compromises his ability to do future assessments if people know what he looks like. But the reporter is persistent, says it's a human interest story, that people deserve to know about it. Caleb pressed his fingers against his temples. "Can't we just say no comment?" "We can, but that often makes reporters more aggressive. They start digging, making connections, building narratives whether we cooperate or not." David paused. "There's another option. You could do an interview on your terms, control the narrative. Make it about the diner's future rather than the billionaire rescue angle." "I don't want to do an interview." "I understand, but if you don't, they'll write the story anyway. And it probably won't be the story you'd want told." Caleb looked around his empty diner, thought about the conversations he'd had all morning, about the growing divide between him and the neighborhood that had been his home for 18 months. "If I do this, can we focus on the community? On how the expansion will create jobs, serve more people?" "We can try to steer it that way, yes." "Then okay, set it up." The interview was scheduled for Monday morning before the Reed Capital team arrived. That gave Caleb the weekend to prepare, which mostly meant lying awake at night rehearsing answers to questions he was terrified of being asked. "Why you? What makes you special? Don't you feel guilty getting saved while others suffer?" Saturday morning brought a development Caleb hadn't anticipated. A protest. Small, maybe 15 people, but there they were on the sidewalk outside his diner holding handwritten signs. "No gentrification on 5th Street. Local businesses for local people. Brooks sold us out." Donald Frazier stood at the center, his arms crossed, his expression triumphant. Caleb watched from inside, his chest tight. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The partnership was supposed to help, supposed to make things better. Instead, it was turning him into a villain in his own neighborhood. Janet arrived around 10, pushing through the protesters with barely concealed irritation. She slammed the door harder than necessary and marched up to the counter. "This is insane," she said. "They're acting like you committed some kind of crime." "They're scared," Caleb replied, echoing Mrs. Chen's words. "I get it." "Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you're being punished for not failing. Punished for accepting help. That's not fair. Neither is getting rescued when other people don't." Janet studied him. "You're feeling guilty." "Shouldn't I be?" "No, you didn't do anything wrong. You were kind to someone who turned out to be able to help you. That's not a crime. That's not even luck. That's consequence. You treated people well, and good things came from it. But only for me. Everyone else is still struggling. So use the partnership to change that. Hire from the neighborhood. Pay fair wages. Keep prices reasonable. Prove to them that this isn't gentrification. It's growth that includes them." Caleb wanted to believe it was that simple. Wanted to believe that good intentions and fair practices would be enough to win people back. But the signs outside told a different story. The weekend crawled by. The protests continued, smaller some hours, larger others, but persistent. Customers dropped to almost nothing, partly because of the protesters, partly because people were uncomfortable with the attention, partly because the neighborhood was choosing sides, and Caleb was rapidly becoming the wrong side to choose. Sunday evening, Thomas Reed called. Not David, not one of the lawyers or consultants, but Thomas himself. "I heard about the protest," he said. His voice was calm, measured. "I'm sorry. This isn't what I intended." "What did you intend?" Caleb asked. He was tired. So tired of defending and explaining and trying to make sense of something that had seemed like a miracle 4 days ago and now felt like a curse. "I intended to help someone who deserved it, to invest in character and see where it led. I didn't anticipate the community backlash." You didn't think people would react badly to seeing one person get saved while everyone else keeps struggling? Thomas was quiet for a moment. You're right. I should have seen it. Should have planned for it. This is my fault, not yours. Doesn't really matter whose fault it is. The result is the same. What do you want to do, Caleb? If you want to walk away from the partnership, we can structure it so you keep the debt relief, but don't take any expansion funding. You can run your diner the way you always have, just without the weight of bankruptcy hanging over you. It was a generous offer. More than generous. It was an escape hatch from a situation that was rapidly becoming untenable. Caleb could take it, could step back from the publicity and the protest and the complications, could return to being just a small diner owner trying to make ends meet, except now he'd actually have a chance of succeeding. But he thought about what Janet had said, about using the partnership to create change that included the neighborhood, not just himself. About proving that growth didn't have to mean gentrification, that success didn't have to come at the expense of the community. No, Caleb said. I don't want to walk away. I want to do this right. I want to show them that this can help everyone, not just me. That's going to be difficult. People have made up their minds about what this represents. Then I'll change their minds. How? Caleb looked out at the empty diner, at the protest signs still visible through the window in the streetlight. I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. The protest had dispersed overnight, but Caleb knew it would return. The reporter, a woman named Lisa Chen, no relation to Marcus, arrived at 8 sharp with a cameraman in tow. She was young, maybe 30, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything about the diner in the first 30 seconds. Mr. Brooks, thank you for agreeing to this interview. Call me Caleb. They sat in one of the booths, the camera pointed at him like an accusation. Lisa set up a recorder between them and pulled out a notepad covered in questions written in tight, efficient handwriting. Let's start with the basics, she said. Tell me about the partnership with Reed Capital Investments. Caleb took a breath and launched into the explanation he'd rehearsed. The financial struggles, Thomas's visit, the debt relief, the expansion opportunity. He tried to keep it factual, unemotional, but Lisa kept pushing for more. But why you? She asked. There are hundreds of struggling businesses in this city. What made Reed Capital choose your diner specifically? I treated someone with respect when I didn't know who they were. That mattered to them. Thomas Reed, you mean? You, the billionaire who posed as a homeless man to test your character. The way she said it made it sound manipulative, almost predatory. Caleb shifted uncomfortably. He was assessing whether I was worth investing in. I understand why that might seem strange, but it seems exploitative, Lisa interrupted. He deceived you, observed you without your knowledge, made judgments about your character based on a performance you didn't know you were giving. It wasn't a performance. I was just being myself. But that's the point, isn't it? You didn't have a choice about whether to participate in his test. He made that choice for you. Caleb hadn't thought about it that way. The idea that he'd been used, even benevolently, settled in his stomach like a stone. I guess you could see it like that. Lisa leaned forward. How do you respond to neighbors who say this partnership will lead to gentrification? That Reed Capital's investment will drive up property values and push out longtime residents? That's not the plan. We want to expand in a way that serves the community, not displaces it. But intentions don't always match outcomes. The road to gentrification is paved with promises about community benefit. The interview continued in that vein for another 40 minutes. Every answer Caleb gave seemed to be twisted into something darker, more complicated, more problematic than he'd intended. By the time Lisa packed up her equipment, he felt like he'd been through a meat grinder. When will this air? He asked. Tonight, 6 o'clock news. She paused at the door. For what it's worth, I do think your heart's in the right place. I'm just not sure that matters when you're dealing with systems that have their own momentum. After she left, Caleb sat in the empty diner and put his head in his hands. This was supposed to be the beginning of something good. Instead, it felt like everything was falling apart before it had even started. The Reed Capital team arrived at noon, 3 consultants led by a woman named Sarah Park, David's sister. She was in her 40s, professionally dressed, with an efficiency that suggested she'd done this many times before. Don't worry about the interview, she said, reading Caleb's expression. We've dealt with skeptical press before. What matters is execution. Show them results, not promises. They spent the afternoon taking measurements, reviewing financials, asking questions about suppliers and customer demographics, and peak hours. Sarah took notes constantly, her pen moving across paper with mechanical precision. "Your margins are terrible," she said without judgment. "You're barely charging enough to cover costs, let alone make profit. I wanted to keep prices fair, affordable for the neighborhood. Noble, but unsustainable. We'll need to adjust pricing while maintaining accessibility. Maybe a sliding scale system, or a membership program that subsidizes meals for people who need it." The ideas came rapid fire: new equipment to reduce waste, better supplier contracts to lower cost, staff training to improve efficiency, a social media presence to attract customers from beyond the immediate neighborhood. Each suggestion made sense individually, but together they added up to something that felt less like Brooks Diner and more like something else entirely. "What about the heart of it?" Caleb asked. "The part where anyone hungry gets fed, regardless of ability to pay?" Sarah looked up from her notes. "That can continue. In fact, we think it should be central to your brand. No one turned away hungry. That's powerful. That's what differentiates you from every other diner in the city." "It's not a brand," Caleb said quietly. "It's who I am." "Then let's make sure it's sustainable. Because right now, it's not. Right now, it's a beautiful idea that was 3 days from collapse. We're trying to give it structure so it can actually survive long enough to help people." She wasn't wrong. Caleb knew she wasn't wrong. But something in him rebelled against the language, against turning compassion into competitive advantage and kindness into marketing strategy. The team left around 5, promising to return Tuesday with preliminary recommendations. Caleb cleaned the diner alone, moving through the familiar motions while trying to quiet the growing unease in his chest. At 6 o'clock, he turned on the small television he kept in the back room and watched himself on the evening news. The segment was titled "Billionaire's Charity, Salvation or Gentrification," and it was every bit as bad as he'd feared. They'd edited the interview to emphasize his uncertainty, his inability to guarantee the partnership wouldn't harm the neighborhood. They'd included footage of the protest, interviews with Donald Frazier talking about corporate takeovers and exploitation. And there, at the end, was Angela Morrison. Her face tired, her voice breaking slightly as she said, "I'm happy for Caleb, I really am. But it hurts to see him get saved when the rest of us are still drowning. It hurts to know that kindness only gets rewarded if the right person is watching." The segment ended with Lisa Chen's voiceover. "Time will tell whether Reed Capital's investment in Brooks Diner represents genuine community development or simply another step toward pricing longtime residents out of their own neighborhood. For now, the diner remains open, and the debate continues." Caleb turned off the television and sat in the darkness of his back room, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. This was supposed to be the answer, the miracle that saved everything. Instead, it was tearing apart the fragile community he'd tried so hard to serve. His phone buzzed. A text from Thomas Reed. "Saw the news. I'm sorry. This isn't what I wanted for you." Caleb stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "What did you want?" The response came quickly. "To give someone good a chance to succeed at being good. I'm starting to think the world doesn't allow for that anymore." Another text followed. "If you want out, say the word. No judgment. I'll make sure you're taken care of either way." Caleb's thumb hovered over the keyboard. It would be so easy to say yes, to take the debt relief and walk away from the complications, to return to obscurity and struggle, but at least to return to being liked by his neighbors. But he thought about Angela Morrison's words, about all the other people drowning while waiting for someone to notice them, about what it would mean if he gave up now, if he proved that the skeptics were right and meaningful change was impossible. He typed, "I'm not out yet, but I need to do this differently. Can we talk tomorrow?" "Absolutely. My office. No, noon." Caleb put down his phone and looked around the diner, at the cracked vinyl and flickering lights and worn counters, at the physical manifestation of 18 months of trying to do good in a world that punished it, at the space that had been saved and might still be lost, just in a different way. Tomorrow he would go to Thomas Reed's office. Tomorrow he would figure out how to make this work without losing himself or his community in the process. Tomorrow he would start trying to prove that maybe, just maybe, succeeding at being good was still possible. But tonight he just sat in the darkness and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd taken on. The partnership wasn't a miracle, it was a responsibility. And Caleb was beginning to understand that responsibility was so much heavier than failure had ever been. Reed Capital's headquarters occupied 3 floors of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building where the elevator required a key card and the lobby featured abstract art that probably cost more than Caleb's entire diner. He stood in the reception area at 11:45, feeling profoundly out of place in jeans and a flannel shirt, while everyone around him wore suits that whispered expensive with every movement. A young woman approached, her smile professional and distant. "Mr. Brooks? Mr. Reed is ready for you. This way, please." The elevator rose silently to the 23rd floor, opened onto a reception area that was all clean lines and muted colors. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretched out in every direction, reduced to geometry and light. Caleb had lived his entire life down there in those streets, but from up here it looked like something else entirely. Like a game board. Like something that could be moved and rearranged according to whoever had the best view. Thomas Reed's office was at the far end of a long hallway. The door was open, and Thomas stood behind a massive desk made of what looked like a single piece of polished walnut. He'd traded his suit for slacks and a sweater, but even casual, he radiated the kind of authority Caleb had never possessed. "Caleb!" Thomas came around the desk, extending his hand. "Thanks for coming." They shook, and Thomas gestured to a seating area by the windows. 2 leather chairs and a couch arranged around a coffee table that was probably worth more than Caleb's car had been before it died 3 years ago. "Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine." They sat, and for a moment neither spoke. Through the window, Caleb could see the neighborhood where his diner sat, though from this height it was impossible to distinguish individual buildings, just blocks and streets, patterns and possibilities. "I watched the news segment 3 times, Thomas said finally. Each time it got worse. "Yeah, well, reporters are good at finding the worst angle." She wasn't wrong, though, about the gentrification concerns, about the optics of a billionaire swooping in to save one person while others struggle. Thomas leaned back, his expression troubled. "I've been doing this for 20 years, Caleb, testing character, investing in people who demonstrate integrity, and I've never had it blow back like this. Maybe because you usually invest in different kinds of businesses, things that don't have the same community visibility. Maybe. Or maybe because I got it wrong this time." Thomas met his eyes. "I thought saving your diner would be simple. Pay the debts, provide support, watch you succeed. I didn't consider how it would look to everyone watching from outside. Didn't think about the message it sends when one person gets rescued while others don't." Caleb had spent all night wrestling with the same thoughts. Angela Morrison said something that keeps replaying in my head about how kindness only gets rewarded if the right person is watching. She's right. There are probably hundreds of people in this city who are just as kind, just as decent as I am. They just didn't happen to catch your attention. So what do we do about that? The question hung between them. Caleb had been thinking about it since yesterday, turning it over from every angle, looking for an answer that made sense. "We expand the model," he said. "Not just my diner. We create a program that identifies other struggling businesses run by people with character, people who treat their communities well, who prioritize people over profit. We give them the same support you gave me." Thomas was quiet, considering. "That's a significant undertaking. The due diligence alone, I know it's complicated, but it's the only way this works. The only way I don't become a symbol of everything people hate about wealth inequality." Caleb leaned forward. "You told me you invest in character, that you're looking for people who demonstrate integrity under pressure. Well, there are more of us out there. Let's find them. And you want to be part of that process? I want to help identify them. I know what it's like to be drowning. I know what desperation looks like. And I know the difference between someone who's struggling but maintaining their principles and someone who's just failing." Caleb paused. "Use me. Use what happened to me as the model, but don't let me be the only one." Thomas stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. The silence stretched long enough that Caleb started to worry he'd overstepped, that he'd somehow insulted the man who'd saved him by suggesting the rescue wasn't enough. "I built this company on the idea that character matters," Thomas said finally. "That the best investments are in people who will do the right thing even when it costs them. But I've been selective to the point of being exclusive. 1 or 2 people a year, maybe that's not enough anymore." "It's not about the number," Caleb said. "It's about the message. Right now the message is that I'm special, that I'm different. But I'm not. I'm just someone who got noticed. Let's change the message to character gets rewarded consistently, not randomly." Thomas turned back from the window. "This would require restructuring how we operate, creating new assessment criteria, building a team dedicated to identifying and vetting potential investments. And it would be expensive, not just the capital investments themselves, but the infrastructure to support them." "Can you afford it?" A ghost of a smile crossed Thomas's face. "Yes, I can afford it." "Then why not do it?" "Because it's risky. Because most businesses fail even with support. Because I could invest millions and see minimal return." "But some will succeed," Caleb countered. "Some will become exactly what you're hoping for. Sustainable businesses run by good people who serve their communities well. Isn't that return enough?" Thomas studied him for a long moment, and Caleb felt the weight of that gaze, felt himself being assessed and measured just as he had been when Thomas sat in his diner eating soup with shaking hands. "You've changed," Thomas said. "In the past week, you've changed." "I got angry," Caleb admitted. "Watching that news segment, seeing Angela's face, hearing Donald talk about selling out. I got angry. Not at them. At the system that makes one person's rescue look like everyone else's abandonment. At the fact that doing good is supposed to be its own reward, but somehow it's never enough to actually survive on. And you think creating a broader program will fix that?" "I think it's a start. I think it's better than just accepting that the world is unfair and moving on." Thomas returned to his chair, settling into it with the careful deliberation of someone making a significant decision. "If we do this, and I'm saying if, it would need to be structured carefully. Clear criteria for selection, transparent processes, regular assessment of both the businesses and the program itself. And you would need to be involved, at least initially. You'd be the face of this, Caleb, the example everyone points to." "I know. The scrutiny will be intense. Every decision will be questioned. Every failure will be used as evidence that the whole thing is misguided." "I know that too." "And you're still willing?" Caleb thought about his diner, about the protesters outside, about the neighborhood that had turned against him in fear. Thought about Angela Morrison working 60 hours a week to make ends meet, about all the other Angela Morrisons in the city struggling in obscurity. Thought about what it would mean to turn this miracle into something systematic, something that could reach beyond just himself. "Yeah," he said, "I'm still willing." Thomas picked up his phone and sent a quick text. Within 30 seconds, David Park entered, followed by Sarah and 2 other people Caleb didn't recognize. "Caleb has a proposal," Thomas said. "I want you all to hear it." For the next 2 hours, they discussed logistics. Sarah raised concerns about scalability and due diligence. David worried about legal liability and regulatory compliance. The others, a financial analyst named Michael and a community development specialist named Dr. Patricia Chen, offered both support and skepticism in equal measure. But slowly, piece by piece, a framework began to emerge. The Character Capital Initiative, they called it. A fund specifically dedicated to investing in small businesses run by people who demonstrated genuine commitment to their communities. Businesses that might be struggling financially but were succeeding at being good, at treating people well, at maintaining integrity under pressure. "We'd need objective criteria," Sarah insisted. "Can't just be gut feeling about someone's character." "Why not?" Caleb challenged. "That's what Thomas used with me. And look at the backlash. We need measurable standards, community impact assessments, reference checks, financial audits, something defensible." "But character isn't measurable," Caleb argued. "Not really. You can't quantify compassion or put integrity on a spreadsheet." Dr. Chen spoke up, her voice thoughtful. "Actually, you can approximate it. Community surveys about business practices, employee satisfaction metrics, customer retention rates, charitable giving patterns. None of it's perfect, but together they create a picture. The discussion continued, growing more detailed, more complex. They talked about funding amounts. Should everyone get the same support Caleb had received, or should it be scaled to need? They debated geography. Should they focus on one city first, or spread investments across multiple communities? They argued about transparency. How much should be public versus private? Caleb listened, occasionally contributing, but mostly trying to absorb the reality of what was happening. An idea he'd voiced an hour ago was becoming a real program with real structure and real money behind it. The scope of it was dizzying. "What about the diner?" he asked during a brief lull. "The original plan for expansion?" "That continues," Thomas said. "You're still the pilot program in a sense. We learn from your experience, what works, what doesn't, and apply those lessons to the broader initiative." "So I'm the guinea pig." "You're the proof of concept," Sarah corrected. "Big difference." By the time Caleb left the office, it was after 3. His head was spinning with proposals and projections, with timelines and budgets. They'd scheduled a press conference for Friday, 4 days away, to announce the Character Capital Initiative. Caleb would be there, alongside Thomas, explaining how his experience had inspired a broader program to support community-focused businesses. The message would be, what happened to Caleb wasn't random luck or arbitrary favor. It was the beginning of something larger, something designed to recognize and reward character systematically rather than sporadically. At least, that was the plan. Caleb took the bus back to the diner, watching the city change as he moved from downtown towers to struggling neighborhoods. The distance between Thomas Reed's office and Brooks' diner was maybe 5 miles, but it felt like crossing between different worlds. When he arrived, the protest had returned. Larger this time, maybe 30 people, with Donald Frazier at the center looking triumphant. Someone had brought a bullhorn. "Corporate greed dressed up as charity," the voice boomed. "Exploitation disguised as help." Caleb stood on the sidewalk, watching his diner under siege, and felt something in him solidify. This was going to get worse before it got better. The announcement of a broader program wouldn't immediately win people over. If anything, it might make them more suspicious. But it was the right thing to do. He was certain of that. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the shouts and questions. Inside, the diner was empty except for Mr. Patterson sitting in his usual booth, calmly working a crossword puzzle like there wasn't a protest happening 10 feet away. "Mr. Patterson?" The old man looked up. "Caleb, hell of a day out there." "You could say that? Don't let them get to you. People fear change, fear what they don't understand. Give them time." "What if they're right to fear it?" Mr. Patterson set down his pencil. "Are they? You planning to gentrify the neighborhood? Drive up rents? Push people out?" "No, God, no." "Then they're not right. They're scared. Different things." Caleb poured himself coffee and sat across from Mr. Patterson. "We're starting a program. Reed Capital. Going to invest in other businesses like mine. People who prioritize community over profit." "That sounds good. Does it? Or does it sound like billionaires deciding who deserves help and who doesn't?" "Depends on how it's done," Mr. Patterson said practically. "Depends on whether the people getting help actually need it and whether they use it well. Depends on whether it's genuine or just PR. How do I prove it's genuine?" "You don't. You just do the work and let the results speak for themselves." The old man returned to his crossword. 6-letter word for trust starts with B. Belief. Doesn't fit, ends in Y. Caleb thought for a moment. Betray. Mr. Patterson filled it in. Trust and betrayal. 2 sides of the same coin. People are waiting to see which one you give them. The evening passed slowly. A few brave customers came in despite the protest, ordering quietly and eating quickly. Caleb served them with automatic courtesy, while his mind churned through everything that had happened, everything that was coming. Around 7, his phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Brooks, this is Angela Morrison." Caleb's pulse quickened. "Angela, hi. I saw you on the news. Heard what I said in that interview." Her voice was tight with emotion. "I want to apologize. I was hurt and angry, and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair." "You don't need to apologize. What you said was true." "Maybe, but it wasn't kind. And you've always been kind to me and my girls." She paused. I heard something about a bigger program, about Reed Capital helping other businesses. Who told you that? Janet Holloway. She called me this afternoon, said you pushed for it, said you argued that if you got saved, others should too. Caleb closed his eyes. We're announcing it Friday. I don't know if it'll work, but it matters that you tried, Angela interrupted. It matters that you didn't just take your miracle and move on. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you for trying. The call ended, and Caleb sat holding the phone, feeling something shift in his chest. One person. That was all it took to make the weight feel a little lighter. One person believing in the possibility of good. The next 3 days were a blur of preparation. Sarah and her team transformed the diner, not in appearance but in operation. New point-of-sale system. Updated menu with adjusted prices. Higher than before but not unreasonable, with a clear fund-a-meal program that let customers pay extra to cover meals for others. Staff training for the 2 employees Caleb hired, young people from the neighborhood who needed work. Each change was explained, justified, made transparent. Sarah insisted on that. No surprises, no hidden agendas. Everything out in the open for the community to see and judge. Donald Frazier and his protesters remained, though their numbers dwindled as the week progressed. Some people got tired of shouting at a building. Others started to see the changes happening, the jobs being created, the genuine effort to include rather than exclude. Thursday night, Caleb barely slept. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Reed Capital's downtown office. Major media had been invited. Thomas had hired a PR firm to manage messaging. Everything was choreographed, planned, designed to present the Character Capital initiative in the best possible light. Caleb hated every minute of it. He arrived at Reed Capital at 9:30, wearing a suit that David had insisted he buy. It felt like a costume, like he was pretending to be someone he wasn't. Thomas met him in the lobby, also in a suit, looking comfortable in a way Caleb envied. Nervous? Thomas asked. Terrified. Good. Means you care about getting it right. Thomas guided him toward the elevator. The key is authenticity. Don't try to sound corporate or polished. Just tell the truth about why this matters to you. The conference room was packed. Cameras, reporters, city officials who'd gotten wind of a major philanthropic announcement. Caleb recognized Lisa Chen in the third row, her expression skeptical but interested. They took their positions at a table draped in Reed Capital's corporate colors. Thomas spoke first, outlining the program's structure and purpose. His words were measured, professional, hitting all the right notes about community investment and sustainable development. Then it was Caleb's turn. He stood, gripping the podium harder than necessary, and looked out at the sea of faces waiting for him to justify his existence. A week ago, he began, I was 3 days from losing everything. My diner was failing, not because I was a bad businessman, but because I couldn't figure out how to be profitable and compassionate at the same time. I kept giving away food to people who couldn't pay, kept treating everyone with respect even when it cost me, and I was about to lose everything because of it. The room was quiet, attentive. Then Thomas Reed walked into my diner dressed like he was homeless, and I fed him. Not because I knew who he was, I didn't, but because he was hungry and I had food. That decision changed my life. Mr. Reed paid my debts, offered me a partnership, gave me a second chance at building something sustainable. Caleb paused, gathering his thoughts. But watching the reaction to that, watching my neighbors protest, watching people call it exploitation or charity or a corporate takeover, I realized something. Getting saved while others drown isn't a miracle. It's a tragedy. It's a sign that the system is broken, that we've created a world where doing good is financially suicidal unless you happen to catch the attention of someone with resources. He saw Lisa Chen writing rapidly, saw Thomas watching him with an expression that might have been pride. So I asked Mr. Reed a question. I asked, what if it wasn't just me? What if we could identify other people running businesses with integrity, people who prioritize their communities over profit margins? What if we could give them the same support, the same chance to succeed without compromising who they are? Caleb met Thomas's eyes. And he said yes. We're launching the Character Capital initiative to do exactly that, to invest in people whose businesses might be struggling financially but are succeeding at being good. to prove that compassion and profitability aren't mutually exclusive, they just need the right support. The questions came immediately. How much funding? What criteria? How would they prevent favoritism or bias? Caleb and Thomas fielded them as best they could, sometimes fumbling, sometimes finding the right words, always trying to convey that this was genuine, that it mattered. Lisa Chen asked the hardest question. Mr. Brooks, critics might say this is just billionaire saviorism, that you're reinforcing power structures where wealthy individuals get to decide who deserves help rather than addressing systemic issues that create inequality in the first place. How do you respond? Caleb took a breath. They're not wrong. This doesn't fix the system. It doesn't address minimum wage laws or healthcare costs or any of the structural problems that make it hard for small businesses to survive while treating people well. But waiting for systemic change while people lose their livelihoods isn't acceptable either. This is what we can do right now, today, to help people who are drowning. It's not perfect, it's not enough, but it's something. The press conference ended after an hour. Caleb fielded a few individual interviews, repeated the same points, tried to sound convinced and convincing. By noon, he was exhausted. Thomas pulled him aside as the room cleared. You did well, better than well. You were honest. Think it'll make a difference? With some people, yes. Others? They'll need to see results before they believe. Thomas squeezed his shoulder. Go home. Rest. The real work starts Monday. Caleb returned to the diner to find the protest gone. In its place was a handwritten sign taped to the window. Give him a chance. He didn't know who'd put it there, didn't recognize the handwriting, but it was something. Inside the diner was quiet. His new employees, Marcus's nephew and one of the Morrison twins, were prepping for the dinner service. They looked up when he entered, their expressions uncertain. How'd it go? Marcus's nephew asked. Time will tell, Caleb replied. That evening, customers returned. Not a flood, but a steady trickle. People who'd been watching, waiting, trying to decide whether to believe in the possibility that this might actually work. They ordered carefully, ate quietly, watched Caleb serve them with the same respect he'd always shown. Mr. Patterson came in for his usual coffee and toast. Angela Morrison brought her daughters for dinner, paying full price without hesitation. Janet stopped by after her shift, sitting at the counter and talking about her uncle's genuine excitement over the initiative, about how he'd spent years looking for a way to scale his character testing model. And late, after closing, as Caleb was wiping down the counter for the final time, someone knocked on the window. He looked up to see a woman in her 50s, her face weathered by struggle, holding a small child's hand. He opened the door despite the closed sign. I'm sorry, she said. I know you're closed, but people are saying you don't turn away hungry people. And my grandson, he hasn't eaten today. Come in, Caleb said. Sit down. I'll make something. He served them soup and sandwiches, watched the child eat with desperate focus. The woman kept apologizing, kept saying she'd pay when she could, kept trying to justify taking up space in a closed diner. Don't worry about it, Caleb told her. Just eat. When they left, she pressed a crumpled $5 bill into his hand despite his protests. For next time, she said. So I'm not taking charity. He watched them disappear into the night, this grandmother and child navigating a city that didn't care if they were hungry. And he thought about the initiative, about all the other businesses that might be created or saved, about all the other people who might find help instead of indifference. It wouldn't fix everything. Lisa Chen had been right about that, but it was something. And standing in his diner, saved and struggling and trying to figure out how to turn a miracle into a movement, Caleb decided that something was enough to keep fighting for. The real test would come Monday. That's when they'd start reviewing applications from other businesses, when the machinery of the Character Capital initiative would begin operating for real. That's when Caleb would discover whether this was truly possible or just another beautiful idea that reality would crush. But tonight, in this moment, he allowed himself to hope. To believe that maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to reward goodness instead of punishing it. To trust that choosing compassion over survival didn't have to mean choosing failure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, Caleb Brooks stood in his diner and felt for the first time in years like he might actually succeed at being who he wanted to be. And that was worth everything. Monday morning arrived with unexpected sunshine, the kind that turned the city's winter grayness into something almost hopeful. Caleb stood outside his diner at 6 a.m., watching the street come alive with delivery trucks and early commuters, and tried to calm the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in his chest. Today, the Character Capital Initiative would begin processing its first applications, and he'd be part of the review team alongside Sarah, Dr. Chen, and 2 other Reed Capital analysts. But first, he had a diner to run. His 2 employees arrived together, Jenna Morrison, the older of the Morrison twins, and Marcus Chen Jr., who insisted everyone call him Junior, despite being 23. They were good kids, eager and surprisingly competent after just a few days of training. Watching them prep the kitchen together, laughing over some shared joke, Caleb felt a pang of something that might have been paternal pride despite the small age difference. The morning rush was stronger than it had been in months. Whether it was curiosity about the press conference or genuine support, people came. Some ordered tentatively, like they were testing whether the diner had changed in some fundamental way. Others acted like nothing unusual had happened at all, like billionaire investments and media coverage were just normal parts of running a neighborhood restaurant. Mrs. Chen arrived at 7:30, sliding onto her usual stool. "My husband watched the press conference," she said without preamble. "Said you handled yourself well." "Thanks. I was terrified." "Good terrified or bad terrified?" "Is there a difference?" She smiled. "Always. Bad terrified makes you freeze up, say things you don't mean. Good terrified makes you honest." She accepted the coffee Caleb poured. "He also said your idea about helping other businesses was smart, that it changes the narrative from lucky guy gets saved to systematic support for good people. That's the hope. Donald Frazier doesn't think so. He's telling anyone who'll listen that this is just phase 1 of corporate takeover, that once you've got a bunch of businesses dependent on Reed Capital money, they'll start calling the shots." Caleb had been expecting this. "What do you think?" Mrs. Chen considered the question while doctoring her coffee with cream and sugar. "I think time will tell. I think intentions matter, but results matter more. And I think you're either going to prove a lot of people wrong or give them ammunition to say they were right all along." She took a sip. "No pressure." By 9:30, Caleb had served breakfast to 43 people, more than double his usual Monday count. He left Jenna and Junior in charge and headed downtown to Reed Capital, where the initiative's review team had commandeered a conference room on the 22nd floor. Sarah had transformed the space into something resembling a war room. 2 walls were covered in whiteboards filled with criteria and evaluation matrices. A third displayed a map of the city with colored pins marking businesses that had already submitted applications. The fourth was floor-to-ceiling windows offering that same God's-eye view of the city that Caleb still found unsettling. "We received 147 applications in 3 days, Sarah announced as Caleb entered. "Way more than we anticipated." Dr. Chen looked up from her laptop. "The press coverage helped. Local news picked up the story. Social media did its thing. Everyone with a struggling business now thinks they might qualify." "Do they?" Caleb asked. "Some do. Most don't." Sarah pulled up a spreadsheet on the main screen. "We've done preliminary filtering based on basic criteria. Businesses that have been operating at least a year, revenue under a certain threshold, no major legal issues. That knocked it down to 82 possibles. And how many can we actually support? First round, 10, maybe 15 if we stretch the budget." The number felt impossibly small against the need. 147 applications meant 147 struggling business owners who dared to hope they might be saved, and they could only help 10. "How do we choose?" Caleb asked quietly. "That's what we're here to figure out." Thomas Reed entered the room, followed by David Park and 2 people Caleb didn't recognize. "These are our community assessment specialists, Maria Gonzalez and James Wright. They'll be conducting on-site evaluations of shortlisted businesses." The morning was spent reviewing applications. Each one was a story of struggle and persistence. A family-owned bookstore that hosted free literacy programs despite barely breaking even. A restaurant that employed ex-convicts and gave them second chances. A repair shop that fixed things for elderly customers at cost. A bakery that donated day-old goods to homeless shelters. On and on, case after case of people trying to do good while the market punished them for it. This one, Dr. Chen said, pulling up an application on the screen. Martinez Auto Repair. Been in the neighborhood 30 years. Owner refuses to do unnecessary work, which means he makes about 60% of what his competitors do. But customer loyalty is through the roof. Community surveys rate him as the most trusted business in a 6-block radius. Financial situation? Sarah asked. Dire. 2 months from closing. Building owner wants to sell to a developer. Can we save it? Sarah ran calculations on her tablet. Debt relief and operating capital would be about $40,000. Building purchase would be another $250,000. Call it $300,000 total. Thomas didn't hesitate. Put him on the short list. James, I want you to visit the shop this week. Talk to customers, employees, neighbors. Verify what the application claims. They moved through the applications with increasing urgency. Each decision felt monumental. Including one business meant excluding others. Choosing who to save meant choosing who to let drown. Around noon, they took a break. Caleb stood by the windows, looking down at the city, and felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him from all sides. Thomas joined him. Having second thoughts? I'm having about 15 thoughts at this point. That's normal, good even. Means you understand what we're doing matters. We can only help 10 businesses, Thomas. 10 out of 147. That means 137 people who applied in good faith are going to be disappointed. Would you rather help none of them? No, but I hate that we have to choose. So do I. Thomas was quiet for a moment. My entire career has been about making choices like this, deciding which investments to make, which to pass on. I've gotten good at it, learned to trust my analysis and instincts, but it never stops being hard. Never stops feeling like I'm playing with people's lives. Then why do it? Because the alternative is paralysis. Helping no one because you can't help everyone is its own kind of cruelty. Thomas turned to face him. The 10 businesses we choose, those 10 will survive because of this. We'll grow, employ people, serve their communities. That's real impact, Caleb. Don't diminish it because it's not infinite. They returned to the conference room and continued reviewing applications. By 3 o'clock, they had a preliminary shortlist of 12 businesses. Sarah wanted to cut it to 10 to stay within budget. Dr. Chen argued for stretching to 15, claiming the marginal cost was worth the additional impact. The debate grew heated. Numbers were thrown around, projections challenged, assumptions questioned. Caleb mostly listened, trying to absorb the complexity of what they were attempting. Finally, Thomas raised a hand. We'll fund 12. I'll increase the initiative budget to accommodate it. But these 12 need to be ironclad. If we're going to make this program credible, we can't afford early failures. The team spent another 2 hours stress testing the shortlist, running additional background checks, verifying community impact claims, analyzing financial projections. By the time Caleb left to return to his diner, he was exhausted but cautiously optimistic. The next 2 weeks were a blur. During the day, Caleb ran his diner, training staff and implementing the operational improvements Sarah's team had recommended. The Fund a Meal program was surprisingly popular, customers paying an extra $5 or $10 to cover meals for others. Within a week, they'd banked enough to feed 30 people who couldn't afford to pay. In the evenings and on his days off, Caleb joined the assessment teams visiting shortlisted businesses. He met Martinez at the auto repair shop, a 60-year-old man with grease under his fingernails and a reputation for honesty that customers spoke about like it was a miracle. He visited Chen's Books, where the owner's daughter ran after-school reading programs for kids whose parents worked late. He toured a small grocery that sold fresh produce at cost in a food desert where the nearest supermarket was 3 bus rides away. Each visit reinforced what he'd suspected. There were hundreds of people trying to run businesses with integrity, treating communities well, even as it bankrupted them. The only difference between Caleb and them was that he'd gotten lucky. He'd been seen. On the 15th day after the press conference, Reed Capital held a private event to announce the first 12 recipients of Character Capital Initiative funding. They'd rented a community center in the neighborhood where Brooks Diner was located, deliberately choosing a space that felt accessible rather than exclusive. The recipients arrived nervous and disbelieving. Caleb recognized the expression on their faces. He'd worn it himself 2 weeks ago. That mixture of hope and fear, the inability to trust that this was real until the contracts were signed and the money was in the bank. Thomas spoke first, explaining the program's purpose and vision. Then each recipient was called forward to receive their funding package. Martinez broke down crying when he learned his shop was being saved. The bookstore owner clutched her daughter and whispered thank you over and over like a prayer. The grocery store owner, a Somali immigrant named Hassan, just stood there shaking his head in disbelief. When it was over, when the contracts were signed and the cameras had finished recording, the recipients mingled with each other and the Reed Capital team. Caleb found himself surrounded by grateful business owners who treated him like he was somehow responsible for their salvation. "You started this," Martinez said, gripping his hand. "You're the reason any of us are here." "I just asked a question," Caleb replied. "Thomas is the one who answered it." "But you asked it. That took guts." Later, as the event was winding down, Caleb saw Donald Frazier standing near the entrance. He'd come despite not being invited, despite having led protests against the very program being celebrated. He stood alone, his arms crossed, watching everything with an expression that was hard to read. Caleb walked over. "Donald." "Brooks." Donald's voice was flat. "Hell of a show you put on." "It's not a show. It's real support for real businesses. We'll see. Check back in 6 months, see how many of them are still around." "You could be happy for them," Caleb said. "You could acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, this is a good thing." "I could. But I've seen too many good things turn bad. Seen too many promises broken." Donald finally met his eyes. "I hope I'm wrong about you, Caleb. I really do. But hope doesn't pay the rent." He left, and Caleb stood there feeling the familiar weight of skepticism. Some people would never be convinced. Some would always see ulterior motives, always expect the worst. And maybe that was okay. Maybe earning trust was supposed to be hard. The following Monday brought unexpected news. Lisa Chen, the reporter who'd done the initial critical coverage, requested another interview. Caleb almost refused. Her first piece had been brutal, but Thomas encouraged him to accept. They met at the diner during the afternoon lull. Lisa set up her recorder and pulled out that same notepad filled with efficient handwriting. "I want to talk about the 12 businesses," she said. "I've been following up on them, visiting the locations, talking to owners and employees." Caleb braced himself for whatever criticism was coming. "Martinez Auto Repair is hiring 2 new mechanics," Lisa continued. "First new hires in 7 years. Chen's Books is expanding their reading program to 3 more schools. Hassan's Grocery is stocking produce from local farms and selling it at prices that undercut the big chains while still making a small profit." "That's good," Caleb said cautiously. "It is good. And it's making me reconsider my initial assessment of this program." Lisa set down her pen. "I'm a journalist. I'm supposed to be skeptical, to look for problems, to hold powerful people accountable. And I still think there are legitimate concerns about wealth inequality and who gets to decide who receives help. But I also think results matter. And the results I'm seeing suggest that maybe this program is actually doing what it claims, helping good people succeed at being good." The interview that aired that evening was dramatically different from the first. Lisa still raised questions about systemic issues and the arbitrariness of charity, but she also showcased the 12 businesses being transformed by initiative funding. She interviewed Hassan about being able to pay his workers living wages for the first time. She filmed Martinez's new hires learning the trade. She showed the reading program at Chen's Books. Kids clustered around stories while the owner's daughter guided them through difficult passages. And she ended with Caleb, standing in his diner, talking about how being saved had taught him that the real miracle wasn't the money. It was the possibility of building a world where compassion didn't have to compete with survival. The segment went viral. Local news became national news. By Tuesday, Caleb's phone was ringing constantly with interview requests, speaking invitations, people wanting to share their own stories of struggling to maintain integrity while running a business. Thomas called Wednesday morning. "We've received over 3,000 new applications." 3,000? The coverage created awareness. People we never would have reached now know the program exists. Thomas sounded energized in a way Caleb hadn't heard before. I'm increasing the initiative budget. We're going to fund 50 businesses in the next round, maybe 100 by year's end. Can you sustain that? Can I afford not to? Caleb, what we're doing is working, actually working. We're proving that character-based investment isn't just feel-good nonsense. It's viable economic development. The expansion happened faster than Caleb could process. Reed Capital hired additional staff dedicated solely to the initiative. They developed more sophisticated assessment tools, streamlined the application process, created regional teams to handle the growing volume. What had started as an experiment was becoming an institution, and through it all, Caleb ran his diner, served meals to hungry people, trained his employees in the philosophy that had almost destroyed him and ultimately saved him. Treat everyone with dignity, charge fair prices, never turn away someone in need. The neighborhood slowly came around. The protesters disappeared. Donald Frazier never apologized, but he stopped actively opposing the program. Angela Morrison brought her daughters in regularly, always paying full price, always leaving generous tips. Even the people who'd called Caleb a fool started nodding to him on the street, acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, he'd been right all along. 3 months after the first 12 businesses received funding, Reed Capital held a review meeting. All 12 were still operating. 8 were profitable. 4 were breaking even but showing strong growth trajectories. None had failed. This is unprecedented, Sarah announced, displaying success metrics on the conference room screen. Typical small business support programs see 30 to 40% failure rates in the first year. We're at 0. It's the selection criteria, Dr. Chen said. We're not just funding good business ideas, we're funding good people who happen to run businesses. Character is a better predictor of success than we realized. Thomas looked at Caleb. You knew this. When you asked me to expand the program, you already understood that integrity was its own form of capital. I knew it kept me going when I had nothing else, Caleb replied. Figured it might work for others too. The program continued expanding. By summer, 130 businesses had received funding. The stories multiplied. A community center saved from closure, a family restaurant able to afford health insurance for its workers, a small manufacturer that refused to use sweatshop labor finally able to compete on price. And with each success, the narrative shifted. What had started as skepticism about billionaire charity evolved into recognition that maybe the problem wasn't wealthy people helping others, it was that help had been random and rare instead of systematic and available. Other investors started paying attention. Some tried to replicate the model. A few succeeded. Many failed, unable or unwilling to prioritize character over pure financial return. But enough succeeded that the concept spread, creating a network of character-based investment funds across multiple cities. 6 months after that first desperate night when Thomas Reed had walked into his diner, Caleb stood in a conference room at Reed Capital, watching a presentation about the initiative's expansion into 5 new cities. 40 businesses in each city would receive funding in the first wave, chosen through the rigorous assessment process that had been refined over dozens of iterations. Thomas stood beside him, both of them watching data about job creation and community impact scroll across screens. You changed everything, Thomas said quietly. You know that, right? I asked a question. You did the changing. No. You insisted that one person's salvation wasn't enough. You demanded that the system itself become more just. That's what changed everything. After the presentation, Caleb returned to his diner. It was late afternoon, the space between lunch and dinner, when things got quiet. Jenna and Junior were prepping for the evening service, working with the easy confidence of people who'd found their place. Mr. Patterson sat in his usual booth with his crossword. Angela Morrison was at a table with her daughters, helping them with homework while they waited for their food. Mrs. Chen stood at the counter chatting with Janet Holloway, who'd stopped by on her break from the hospital. This was what it was all about. Not the press conferences or expansion plans or national media coverage. This. People in a neighborhood diner being treated well, treating each other well, creating the small daily miracles of human decency that held communities together. The door opened. A young woman entered, maybe 25, looking exhausted and uncertain. She stood inside the entrance like she wasn't sure if she belonged. Caleb recognized the look. He'd seen it on Thomas Reed's face 6 months ago, on his own face in the mirror during the darkest days. on every person who'd ever felt invisible, expendable, forgotten. "Come in," he said. "Sit anywhere. What can I get you?" She sat at the counter slowly. "I don't have much money." "That's okay. What sounds good?" "Just anything warm, please." Caleb made her soup and a sandwich, served it with coffee and a glass of water. Watched her eat with the desperate focus of someone who'd been hungry too long. When she finished, he waved away her attempt to pay. "It's covered," he said. "Fund a meal program. Other customers pay it forward." Her eyes filled with tears. "Why?" "Because you're hungry, and we have food. It's not more complicated than that." After she left, Mr. Patterson approached the counter. "You're still doing it," he observed. "Even with all the success, even with the fancy partnerships and media attention, you're still just feeding people who need feeding." "That's all this ever was," Caleb said. "Everything else is just infrastructure to keep it going." That evening, after closing, Caleb sat alone in his diner with a cup of coffee and the day's receipts. The numbers were good. Better than good. The diner was genuinely profitable for the first time since opening. He could afford to pay his employees well, to maintain the building, to keep feeding anyone who walked through the door hungry. His phone buzzed. A text from Thomas. "Board meeting next month. Want you to present the initiative's one-year results. Your perspective matters." A year. It had been almost a year since that desperate night when everything changed. A year since kindness had been rewarded instead of punished. A year since one question, "What if it wasn't just me?" had transformed into a movement that was changing how investment and community development worked. Caleb thought about all the business owners who'd been saved, all the employees who still had jobs, all the communities that had kept essential services because someone decided character was worth investing in. He thought about the criticisms that persisted, and they did persist because skepticism was healthy and questions about equity and access were legitimate. Not everyone who applied got funded. The program couldn't solve systemic poverty or wage inequality or any of the structural problems that made running an ethical business so difficult. But it helped. That was undeniable. Hundreds of businesses that would have failed were thriving. Thousands of people had jobs they might not have had. Communities had resources they'd been about to lose. And it all started because Caleb Brooks had fed a hungry man without asking questions, had chosen compassion over self-preservation, had believed that maybe, just maybe, being decent should be enough. The door to his diner was locked, the lights mostly off, but through the window Caleb could see the neighborhood continuing its evening rhythms, people walking home from work, kids playing on stoops, the city living and breathing and struggling and surviving. Tomorrow he'd open again, serve breakfast to whoever came, continue the work that had almost destroyed him and ultimately defined him. Keep proving that success and goodness weren't mutually exclusive. They just needed the right support, the right structure, the right belief that character mattered as much as capital. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Angela Morrison. "Thank you for giving Jenna a job. She loves working for you. You've given her more than a paycheck. You've shown her what good work looks like." Caleb typed back, "She's earned every dollar. Thank you for raising someone so good at treating people well." He finished his coffee and stood, looking around the diner that had been saved and in saving had sparked something larger than itself. The cracked vinyl had been replaced, the flickering lights fixed, the worn counters refinished. But the heart of it, the fundamental commitment to feeding hungry people and treating everyone with dignity, remained exactly the same. That was the real miracle. Not that billionaire intervention had saved a failing business, but that choosing compassion, consistently and without calculation, had created value that transcended any balance sheet. Caleb turned off the remaining lights and climbed the stairs to his apartment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new people walking through the door needing help or offering it. The work would continue, as it always had, as it always would. But tonight, for the first time in as long as he could remember, Caleb Brooks went to sleep not with dread or anxiety, but with something that felt dangerously close to peace. He'd been tested without knowing it, saved when he'd given up hope, and given the chance to transform his rescue into something systematic and sustainable. He'd taken that chance, had insisted that one miracle wasn't enough, had demanded that the world become more just, one business at a time, one meal at a time, one act of compassion at a time. And somehow, impossibly, it was working. The diner would open again at 6 a.m. The city would continue its struggles. People would still go hungry, businesses would still fail, injustice would still persist. But in this neighborhood, on this corner, there was proof that another way was possible, that treating people well could be profitable, that character was capital worth investing in, that kindness, supported and sustained, could survive. Caleb closed his eyes and let himself feel what he'd earned through months of struggle and doubt and persistent belief in something better. Not triumph, not vindication, just the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd chosen who he wanted to be and discovered that maybe, just maybe, the world had room for people like that after all. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more challenges, more opportunities to prove that this wasn't a fluke or a one-time miracle, but a sustainable model for how business and community could support each other. And Caleb would meet those challenges the same way he'd met everything else, with honesty, with compassion, and with the stubborn belief that doing good shouldn't cost everything. But tonight, he simply rested. Grateful for second chances. Grateful for being seen. Grateful for the opportunity to turn his salvation into a system that could save others. The eviction notice that had once sat on his counter was long gone, replaced by contracts and expansion plans and proof that character-based investment worked. The homeless man who'd tested him had become a partner and friend. The neighborhood that had protested had become, if not universally supportive, at least willing to give him the chance to prove his intentions matched his words. And Brooks' Diner, the small restaurant that had almost died from an excess of compassion, was alive and thriving, proof that sometimes, when the world seems determined to punish goodness, the right response isn't to become harder, but to fight for a world where goodness can survive. Caleb had fought that fight, was still fighting it, would continue fighting it for as long as it took. And as he drifted off to sleep, he carried with him the knowledge that tomorrow, when he opened those doors again, anyone hungry would be fed. Anyone needing work would be given a chance. Anyone requiring dignity would receive it without question. That was the promise he'd made when he first opened his diner. The promise that had almost destroyed him. The promise that had ultimately saved him. And now, finally, it was a promise he could keep.